Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the ordinary hides the extraordinary, and the truth is often more terrifying than fiction. Tonight we bring you 3 unsettling stories, each one peeling back the layers of reality to reveal dark secrets long buried. First, we descend beneath the streets of Cincinnati, where a routine inspection uncovers a disturbing presence lurking in the shadows. Next, we travel to the remote wilderness of Alaska, where the earth itself seems to be alive, hiding a mystery too dangerous to ignore. And finally, we dive into a journalist's investigation in New Mexico that leads to a secret so deeply buried, even the government wants it erased. Prepare yourself for a journey through the unknown, where not everything is as it seems. Beneath the city. The sewers beneath Cincinnati are older than most people realize. A labyrinth of tunnels and forgotten passages built in the late 1800s, they were designed to manage the overflow from the Ohio River. Stretching for miles under the city's bustling streets, these tunnels are like hidden veins, quietly supporting the life above. Most folks don't give them a second thought. But for people like me, they're a daily reality. My name's Tim Carter, and I've been working for the Cincinnati Department of Public Works for over a decade. My job isn't glamorous. It's me, a hard hat and a flashlight, making sure the city's wastewater flows smoothly, clearing blockages, inspecting tunnels, and ensuring everything runs as it should. It's dirty work, but it's honest, and it keeps the city running. About a month ago, things started getting unusual. It began with reports from locals fishing along the Ohio River. They were pulling out dead animals, raccoons, dogs, even a deer that looked strange, bloated and discolored like they'd been in the water too long. Some had odd marks on them, but animals get into all sorts of trouble, so we didn't think much of it. Then we got a call about a blockage in one of the main sewer lines near the river, probably just a buildup of debris after the recent heavy rains. My supervisor asked me to check it out, so I grabbed my gear and headed down. The entrance to the tunnel was in an industrial part of town, near some old warehouses, the kind of place that's quiet during the day and deserted at night. I parked my truck, put on my gear, and descended the metal ladder into the depths below. As I entered the tunnel, the familiar smells of the sewer greeted me, a mix of damp earth, stagnant water, and the less pleasant odors that come with the job. I've gotten used to it over the years. I turned on my flashlight and started making my way through the passage, the beam cutting through the darkness. About half a mile in, I noticed the water level was higher than usual. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to make me wonder what was causing the backup. The tunnel walls were slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed around me. As I approached the area where the blockage was reported, I began to see debris floating in the water. Plastic bottles, sticks, and other trash that had found its way into the system. But mixed in with the usual garbage were things that didn't belong. Pieces of fabric, a worn-out shoe, and what looked like a child's toy. My gut told me something was off. I reached the blockage, a mass of debris jammed where the tunnel narrowed. I started working to clear it, using my tools to pull away the tangled mess. That's when I noticed a smell different from the usual sewer odors. It was a pungent, almost metallic scent that made me wrinkle my nose. As I moved a piece of wood aside, something caught my eye. Wedged between the debris was a bone. Not a small animal bone like you'd expect to see from time to time, but something larger. Human-sized. I froze. I radioed my supervisor. "Hey, Mark, I think we might have a situation here." "What do you mean?" he replied. "I've found some remains. Might be human." There was a pause. "All right, Tim. Back out of there. We'll need to get the authorities involved." As I started to retrace my steps, my flashlight flickered. I tapped it a few times and the light steadied. I made a mental note to replace the batteries later. Just then I heard a sound, a faint splash further down the tunnel. Probably just water dripping, I told myself. But then it came again, louder this time. It sounded like something moving through the water. "Hello?" No response. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing beyond the beam's reach. I felt a chill run down my spine. It's not uncommon to run into animals down here. Stray cats, rats, sometimes even a lost dog. But this felt different. I picked up my pace, heading back toward the entrance. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd hear a faint ripple or see a slight movement out of the corner of my eye. Over the next few days, the police investigated the remains. It turned out they belonged to a homeless man who had been reported missing a few weeks prior. The preliminary conclusion was that he had somehow gotten into the sewer and drowned. The tunnels can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with them. I tried to put the incident out of my mind and returned to my routine, but things kept getting stranger. We started receiving more reports of unusual debris at other sewer outlets. Personal items like wallets, clothing, even an old bicycle. It was as if people's belongings were ending up in the sewers at an alarming rate. One afternoon, I was assigned to inspect a section of the sewer system closer to downtown. As I made my way through the tunnels, I noticed scratch marks along the walls, long parallel lines that ran for several feet before stopping abruptly. I examined them more closely. They were too uniform to be random and too deep to have been made by any small animal. That evening, I met up with my co-worker, Jake, at a local diner. Over coffee, I told him about the marks. He nodded thoughtfully. You know, I've been hearing some of the guys talk about odd things down there lately. Strange noises, equipment going missing. Like what? I asked. Well, Mike said he thought he saw someone down there last week, a person, but when he called out, they just disappeared around a corner. Could be people using the tunnels to get around, maybe even live. I considered this. It was possible. The homeless population sometimes sought shelter in the sewers, though it was dangerous. Jake leaned in. Between you and me, some of the older guys talk about the tunnel man. Supposedly, there's someone or something that lives down there. I chuckled. Sounds like an urban legend. Maybe. But too many folks have had odd experiences for it to be nothing. A few days later, I was sent to inspect a section of tunnels near an old, unused part of the sewer system. It was scheduled for renovation, and we needed to assess its condition. As I descended into the tunnel, the air grew noticeably cooler. The walls here were older, made of brick rather than concrete, and the passageways were narrower. About an hour into the inspection, I came across an old maintenance door I hadn't seen before. Rusted and slightly ajar, it wasn't on any of the maps. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, revealing a small chamber. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the space, showing walls covered in graffiti and symbols I didn't recognize. In one corner, there was a makeshift bed, old blankets and cushions arranged neatly. Nearby sat a collection of items. A wristwatch, a pair of glasses, and a wallet. I picked up the wallet and opened it. Inside was an ID belonging to the homeless man whose remains we'd found weeks earlier. A sense of unease settled over me. Just then, a noise behind me made me jump. A soft shuffle, like a footstep. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the area, but saw nothing. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I decided it was time to leave. As I exited the chamber and closed the door behind me, I heard a whisper. It was so faint I wondered if I'd imagined it. I hurried back through the tunnel, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, and the usual sounds of the sewer felt amplified. When I finally reached the surface, I took a deep breath of fresh air. I reported what I'd found to my supervisor, emphasizing the safety concerns of unauthorized people in the tunnels. The following week, the department arranged for a team to thoroughly search the area. They didn't find anyone, but they did discover more evidence that someone had been living down there, recently too. After that, access to that part of the sewer was restricted until further notice. I still go down into the tunnels as part of my job, but I stick to the well-mapped and frequently used sections. Yet, every so often, when I'm alone in a quiet stretch of tunnel, I can't help but feel like someone's there with me. Maybe it's just my imagination fueled by the stories and the unsettling experiences. Or maybe there's truth to the tales of the Tunnel Man. Working beneath the city has made me appreciate the world above all the more. The sun, the open spaces, the company of others. The sewers are a necessary part of urban life, but they can also be a place of secrets and mysteries. I often think about the people who might be down there seeking shelter or hiding from the world. I hope they find safety and help. As for me, I'll keep doing my job ensuring the city runs smoothly, but I'll also keep an eye out for both practical hazards and the unknown. Because beneath the city, in the darkness and the silence, you never know what or who you might encounter. The breathing earth. There's a stretch of land just outside Anchorage, Alaska, that locals tend to avoid. A barren expanse where nothing grows, not even the hardy shrubs that survive in the harsh tundra. They call it the breathing earth. When I first heard the name, I thought it was just another piece of folklore, a tale to entertain tourists. As a geologist with years of experience, I was skeptical. But curiosity got the better of me, and I soon found myself entangled in a mystery I never anticipated. My name is Eric Tanner. I've spent most of my career studying tectonic shifts, fault lines, and volcanic activity, trying to understand the movements of the earth beneath our feet. When the university where I worked received a request from the U.S. Geological Survey to investigate unusual seismic readings north of Anchorage, I was intrigued. The area had no known fault lines or volcanic activity, yet sensors were picking up consistent tremors. They needed someone to investigate, and I volunteered. I arrived in Anchorage on an overcast morning in late September. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of early snowfall. After picking up a sturdy rental truck, I gathered my equipment: seismographs, ground-penetrating radar, and other tools of the trade. I stocked up on supplies, extra batteries, warm clothing, and plenty of coffee, knowing the Alaskan wilderness could be unforgiving. The drive north was both beautiful and isolating. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. The road narrowed as I left the city behind, winding through dense forests that gradually gave way to open plains. Occasionally, I'd spot a moose grazing or a hawk circling overhead, but as I approached the coordinates provided, signs of life dwindled. The site was unremarkable at first glance, a flat stretch of land dotted with rocks and bordered by a thick line of evergreens. Stepping out of the truck, I was struck by the silence. No rustling of animals, no birdsong, just the faint whisper of the wind. The ground underfoot felt solid but somehow different, as if it held secrets beneath its surface. I began setting up my equipment, placing seismographs at intervals to measure any ground movement. The initial readings were normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Hours passed as I took soil samples and mapped the area. The sky grew overcast and a light drizzle began to fall, prompting me to set up a small canopy to protect the gear. Just as I was considering packing up for the day, the seismograph registered a slight tremor. I glanced at the readout, a minor blip, but enough to catch my attention. Then another tremor, slightly stronger. I felt a subtle vibration through the soles of my boots. Kneeling, I placed my hand on the damp ground. There it was, a rhythmic pulsation, faint but unmistakable. Curiosity piqued. I decided to deploy the ground-penetrating radar. As I moved the device over the area, the screen displayed an anomaly, a cavity or void about 10 feet below the surface. It was unusual for this region. I double-checked the equipment to rule out any malfunction. I marked the spot and decided to dig a small exploratory hole. The soil was surprisingly loose, making the task easier than expected. About 3 feet down, my shovel hit something solid with a metallic clang. Frowning, I cleared away more dirt to reveal a metal surface, a large rusted plate embedded horizontally in the ground. I brushed away the dirt, revealing intricate patterns etched into the metal. They weren't any symbols or markings I recognized. Taking out my camera, I snapped several photos and sent them to a colleague back at the university. "Any idea what this could be?" I texted along with the images. He responded after a few minutes. "Strange. Doesn't match any known survey markers or equipment." Could be remnants from old military tests or installations. Proceed with caution. As I pondered the object's origin, a low hum resonated through the air. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. The metal plate vibrated slightly under my hand. I stood up, a knot forming in my stomach. The ground around me began to undulate gently, like the surface of a calm sea responding to a distant disturbance. It wasn't violent or sudden, just a smooth, rhythmic rise and fall. I took several steps back, watching in disbelief. I grabbed my phone and recorded a video narrating the events for documentation. I'm witnessing an unusual ground movement in the area known as the breathing earth. No seismic activity is reported elsewhere, and this movement is localized. The hum intensified and the air felt charged, similar to the sensation before a lightning storm. I decided it was time to leave. As much as I wanted to understand what was happening, my instincts told me to retreat. I packed up my equipment swiftly, casting glances at the still-moving ground. The phenomenon seemed confined to a specific area, not following me as I moved. Once everything was secured, I climbed into the truck and started the engine. As I drove away, I noticed in the rearview mirror that the ground had returned to normal. The hum faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the wilderness. Relief washed over me, but questions swirled in my mind. Back in Anchorage, I compiled my data and sent detailed reports to both the university and the U.S. Geological Survey. I included the photos, videos, and all instrument readings. I hoped they could provide some answers. A week later, I received an email requesting a meeting with officials from the USGS and another agency that wasn't specified. We met at a government building downtown. Present were a few scientists and men in suits who introduced themselves with vague titles. "Mr. Tanner, thank you for your thorough report," one of them began. "We'd like to discuss your findings and ask that you refrain from sharing this information publicly." I was taken aback. "May I ask why?" "National security," he replied, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were satellite images of the area, showing heat signatures and other anomalies. "Is this related to military activity?" I inquired. They exchanged glances. "We can't disclose that. What we can tell you is that the area is now restricted. We appreciate your cooperation." Leaving the meeting, I felt a mix of frustration and intrigue. Back at the university, colleagues avoided discussing the topic, and my access to the data I'd collected was restricted. It was as if the entire event had been erased. Determined to find answers, I reached out to contacts in the geological community. Off the record, someone hinted that similar occurrences had been noted in remote areas but were quickly classified. I decided to let it go. Pushing further could jeopardize my career or worse. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening beneath that patch of land, something beyond natural geological processes. Months passed and life returned to normal. I immersed myself in other projects, but occasionally I'd hear whispers of strange events. Unexplained lights in the Alaskan skies, odd communications interference. Stories shared among locals but never officially acknowledged. One evening, while attending a lecture at the university, an old colleague approached me. "You were at the Breathing Earth, weren't you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. "Why?" He glanced around before speaking. "I've heard rumors of underground facilities, experimental technologies. They say the Earth itself reacts to certain frequencies." "Are you suggesting the ground movement was man-made?" I questioned. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps we're tapping into forces we don't fully understand. I still don't have concrete answers about what I experienced. Was it a natural phenomenon, undisclosed technology, or something else entirely? As a scientist, I rely on data and observable evidence. But sometimes, mysteries remain just that. The Earth holds many secrets, and perhaps some are meant to stay buried. I've learned that not all questions lead to answers, and not all discoveries are meant to be shared. When I think back to that silent stretch of land and the rhythmic rise and fall of the ground, I feel a mix of wonder and humility. Our planet is dynamic and ever-changing, full of surprises that challenge our understanding. For now, The breathing earth remains a quiet enigma, a reminder that even in the age of technology and information, there are still places where the unknown persists. Buried secrets. I've spent most of my career digging for the truth, but sometimes the truth is buried for a reason. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden. My name is James Keller, and I'm a freelance journalist. Over the years, I've covered everything from political scandals to corporate fraud, always chasing the stories others try to keep in the shadows. But the story I stumbled upon in Santa Fe was different. It wasn't just a story someone didn't want told. It was a secret they were willing to do anything to protect. It all began when I received a call from an old friend, Luis Ortega. Luis was a historian at the University of New Mexico, specializing in the history and culture of Native American tribes in the Southwest. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but his voice on the other end of the line was urgent. "James, I need your help," he said, his words rushed. "I've uncovered something significant, something that could change everything we know about this area. But I can't talk about it over the phone." "Luis, slow down," I replied. "What's going on?" "Please, can you come to Santa Fe? It's important." I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. I could hear the tension in his voice. Luis was always passionate about his work, but this was different. There was an edge of fear I'd never heard before. "All right," I agreed. "I'll catch the next flight out." I arrived in Santa Fe the following afternoon. The city's adobe buildings and vibrant art scene contrasted sharply with the urgency of Luis's call. I headed straight to his office at the university, but when I got there, his door was locked. A note taped to it read, "Office hours canceled until further notice." Puzzled, I approached the department secretary. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Professor Ortega." She glanced up. "I'm sorry, but Luis hasn't been in for a few days. He didn't say where he was going." Concern gnawed at me. I tried calling his cell phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. Deciding to check his apartment, I drove across town to his place. A modest single-story house on a quiet street lined with cottonwood trees. I knocked on the door. No answer. Peering through the front window, I saw no signs of movement. Everything looked neat and undisturbed. I was about to leave when a neighbor approached. "Are you looking for Luis?" she asked. "Yes, have you seen him recently?" She shook her head. "Not since earlier this week. He seemed on edge. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I'll keep trying to reach him." With no leads, I decided to dig into his work at the university. Luis and I had collaborated on stories before, so I knew his research habits. He often used the university library's archives, so that's where I headed next. The librarian recognized me. "James, it's been a while. What brings you here?" "I'm looking into some of Luis Ortega's recent research. Do you know what he's been working on?" She hesitated. "He was requesting a lot of old land records, government documents related to land grants and acquisitions from the early to mid-20th century. Any idea why?" She lowered her voice. "He mentioned something about discrepancies in how certain lands were obtained, especially around the Navajo reservations. He seemed disturbed by what he was finding." She helped me locate the materials Luis had been reviewing. As I sifted through the dusty files and faded maps, a pattern began to emerge. There were records of land purchases and transfers that didn't add up, documents indicating that parcels of land were acquired under dubious circumstances, often without proper compensation to the tribes. One location kept appearing, a place referred to as Coyote Ridge. It was a remote area northwest of Santa Fe, bordering Navajo territory. Notes in Luis's handwriting were scribbled in the margins. Unauthorized excavations? Government facilities? What's being hidden? Among the papers, I found a photocopy of an old topographic map. Coyote Ridge was circled in red, with a question mark next to it. The next morning, I decided to drive out to Coyote Ridge. The road took me through miles of open desert, the horizon stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. Sagebrush and cacti dotted the landscape, and occasionally a hawk would soar overhead. As I approached the area marked on the map, the paved road turned to dirt, and eventually the dirt road faded into rugged terrain. I parked the car and continued on foot, the silence of the desert enveloping me. After about half an hour of walking, I noticed something out of place, a chain-link fence partially concealed by the landscape. It was old and rusted, with a faded "No Trespassing" sign hanging crookedly. Beyond the fence, the ground sloped downward into what looked like an abandoned excavation site. Curiosity pushed me forward. I found a section where the fence had been damaged, possibly by weather or neglect, and slipped through. The site appeared deserted. There were remnants of old equipment, rusted metal beams, discarded barrels, and the skeletal frame of what might have been a storage shed. In the center of the site was a large, flat slab of concrete. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, but as I approached, I noticed a metal hatch embedded in the surface. It was secured with a heavy padlock, which, to my surprise, was new, gleaming steel contrasting with the decay around it. I hesitated. This was clearly meant to keep people out. But Luis had been here. I was sure of it. Looking around to ensure I was alone, I retrieved a small toolkit from my backpack. It took some effort, but I managed to pick the lock. The padlock clicked open, and I lifted the hatch. A ladder descended into darkness. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my flashlight and began to climb down. The air grew cooler as I descended, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. At the bottom, I found myself in a concrete tunnel. The walls were lined with wires and old conduit pipes, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. Proceeding cautiously, I followed the tunnel, which branched off into several corridors. Small rooms lined the passageways, some empty, others containing outdated equipment. Control panels with blinking lights, monitors displaying static, and filing cabinets left ajar. In one of the rooms, I found a table strewn with documents. Most were stamped classified or property of the U.S. government. I flipped through them, my pulse quickening. The files detailed a project known as Operation Deep Reach, involving geological surveys and underground facilities built during the Cold War. But there was more. References to biohazard materials, radiation testing, and containment procedures stood out. One memo mentioned unexpected side effects on the local environment and emphasized strict secrecy. A notebook lay open on the table, filled with handwritten entries. The handwriting matched Luis's. He had been here, documenting everything. Evidence of unauthorized experiments, one entry read. Potential exposure risks to nearby communities. Need to inform authorities. I snapped photos of the documents with my phone. This was big, possibly one of the biggest stories of my career. As I prepared to leave, a faint sound echoed down the corridor, a distant clang, like metal on metal. I froze, listening intently. Footsteps, growing louder. Quickly, I hid in a shadowed corner of the room, extinguishing my flashlight. Two figures passed by the doorway, their silhouettes barely visible. They wore uniforms and carried flashlights, their beams scanning the tunnel ahead. "Area secure," one of them said into a radio. "No signs of intrusion." My heart pounded. How had they not seen the open hatch or my footprints in the dust? As they moved on, I realized I needed to get out immediately. Carefully, I retraced my steps, staying close to the walls and avoiding the beams of light. Reaching the ladder, I climbed up as quietly as possible. The desert sun was a welcome sight as I emerged, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I closed the hatch, reattached the padlock to make it appear undisturbed, and hurried back to my car. Back in Santa Fe, I tried contacting Luis again, but still no response. Concerned, I went to the local authorities to report him missing. They took my statement but seemed indifferent, suggesting he might have gone on a research trip without informing anyone. Frustrated, I decided to write up my findings. I compiled the photos, documents, and notes into a comprehensive report. Before publishing, I reached out to a trusted editor at a national newspaper. "This is explosive stuff, James," he said over the phone. but we need to verify everything before we can run it. I understand, I replied, but time might be critical. There's more going on out there than outdated government projects. That night, as I was reviewing my notes in my hotel room, there was a knock at the door. Thinking it might be room service, I opened it without hesitation. 2 men stood there, one in a suit, the other in casual attire. "Mr. Keller?" the suited man asked. "Yes?" "We'd like to speak with you about your visit to Coyote Ridge today." A chill ran down my spine. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" They showed me badges, some agency I didn't recognize. "We need you to come with us." I knew I was in trouble. "Am I under arrest?" "Not at this time," the man replied, "but we strongly advise your cooperation." I considered my options. Running wasn't feasible, and causing a scene might make things worse. "All right," I agreed. "Let me grab my jacket." As I turned back into the room, I discreetly pulled my phone from the table and slipped it into my pocket, hoping they hadn't noticed. They escorted me to an unmarked car parked outside. The drive was silent, tension filling the air. We arrived at an office building on the outskirts of town. Inside, they led me to a sparsely furnished room and offered me a seat. "Mr. Keller," the suited man began, "we're aware of your investigation into the Coyote Ridge facility." "Is that what it is? A facility?" I challenged. He ignored my question. "The site is classified. Any information you've obtained is considered sensitive and poses a risk to national security. I'm a journalist. I have a right to report on matters of public interest." "Not when it jeopardizes security," he replied sternly. "We need all materials you've collected, notes, photos, documents." I met his gaze. "What happened to Luis Ortega?" "Professor Ortega is, unavailable." "Is he alive?" The man paused. "That's not your concern." Realizing the gravity of the situation, I decided to negotiate. "I'll hand over my materials on one condition. You confirm that Luis is safe." He considered this. Agreed. Reluctantly, I handed over a USB drive containing copies of my files. I still had backups elsewhere, but they didn't need to know that. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "We trust you understand the importance of discretion in this matter." As they escorted me out, the man added, "Oh, and Mr. Keller, it would be best for everyone if you left Santa Fe immediately." I didn't need to be told twice. Back at my hotel, I packed my bags and checked out. Before leaving town, I made one last attempt to find Luis, visiting places he frequented. Cafes, bookstores, the park where he liked to jog. No one had seen him. Feeling defeated, I began the drive back home. Along the way, I contacted my editor again, explaining the situation. "James, this sounds serious," he said. "Maybe we should hold off for now." "No," I insisted. "People need to know what's happening. Luis might be in danger because of this." "All right," he conceded. "But we need to proceed carefully." Over the next few weeks, we worked discreetly to verify the information and prepare the story for publication. However, every source we contacted either refused to speak or claimed no knowledge of the project. It was as if any trace of Operation Deep Reach had been wiped from existence. One morning, I received a package at my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note in Luis's handwriting. "Let it go, James, for your safety and mine." There was also a photograph of us from years ago at a conference, smiling and carefree. I stared at the note, conflicted. Luis was alive, but clearly under duress. Publishing the story might put him, and possibly others, in more danger. After much contemplation, I decided to archive the materials. Maybe one day the time would be right to bring the truth to light, but for now, the risks were too great. But I returned to writing other stories, but the experience left a lasting impact. I learned that some secrets are guarded not just by individuals, but by entire systems designed to keep them hidden. The pursuit of truth is important, but so is the consideration of the consequences that truth might bring. I hope that Luis is safe and that one day we'll reconnect. Until then, the buried secrets of Coyote Ridge remain a haunting reminder of the shadows that exist just beyond our sight. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more unsettling mysteries that lurk just beyond the surface. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, not all stories are meant to be told.